Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Hannah Botterell. I am a sophomore at the college studying either social studies or history and literature, and I currently serve as a student intern and the director of marketing here at the JFK Jr. Forum. Before we get into what is sure to be a fantastic conversation, I have just a couple of points of housekeeping to take care of. So firstly, please take note of the emergency exits closest to you. We have one over on Parkside and one over on JFK Street side. In the case of an emergency, exit out the door closest to you and then congregate over in JFK Park. Secondly, please take the time now to silence your cell phones. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce Mr. Arnon Mishkin, who is currently a resident fellow here at the IOP and will be announcing tonight's forum. And I would also like to briefly make note of our student moderators, Nadia Douglas and Ajay Sharma, who will introduce themselves later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nadia. I think Stephen, you're in the middle. Okay, so as many of you know, I'm a contractor for Fox News, focused primarily on election night coverage. So appropriately, I've been asked to introduce one of the stars of MSNBC, as well as NBC News, NBC Sports, Steve Kornacki. Steve is a very impressive competitor. Still, you'd think that the IOP resident fellow would get some home field advantage. But on behalf of Steve, if anyone gets a score in the Astro Red Sox game, feel free to interrupt the forum here, particularly if the Red Sox score. Anyway, Steve is primarily known at MSNBC for his energy, his ability to make complex data stories understandable in front of his big board, which is the subject tonight, as well as for his khakis. Still, a colleague told me today, as he's one of the guys, when you see him on the screen, you turn the volume up, which frankly used to be Roger Ailes' rule for what makes a good TV person. Do you turn the volume up when you see them on TV? Still, as a competitor or whatever, we've asked to make things even. And so on behalf of whoever, we're going to ask you to stay seated with your face covered. And on that, I'll turn it over to Nadia. Or Ed.
Awesome, and I will actually turn it over to Ajay.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We're delighted to see all of you here tonight. My name is Ajay Sarma. I'm a junior at Harvard College studying social studies and psychology. I'm from St. John's, Florida, and I'm currently the director of research for the JFK Jr. Forum.
Hello, and my name is Nadia Douglas. I'm a junior at the college studying government on the data science track with a secondary in sociology. I'm from Arlington, Texas, born and raised, and I'm serving as the chair of the Fellows and Study Groups program. Tonight, we have the privilege of welcoming journalist Steve Kornacki to the forum this evening. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Questions. Steve, your career as a political journalist has spanned many key events in recent American political history. How has the past decade or so of American politics shaped the journalistic profession, and are there any key inflection points, personal or political, that you can identify in your own career trajectory?
In my own career, going beyond the last decade, because I'm getting pretty old now, I mean, I can honestly tell you, I think this is true of my own career, and I think it's true of media and politics in general. It's the rise of the internet. And I say that because my career kind of owes itself to that. My first job was covering politics in New Jersey. I got the job out of college, went to a school near here, probably your safety school, Boston University. No, I'm sure it wasn't. It was something that was novel at the time, and I'm dating myself here, but this was it was a state-specific political news site. So not a newspaper, no print product, everything is online. It was New Jersey political news. And there wasn't much like this in the country at the time, but it gave me a chance. You know, in the old days, I say old days, the 1990s or earlier, coming out of college and wanting to get into political journalism and wanting to cover, for instance, like a U.S. Senate race, a governor's race, congressional races. These are the sorts of things I was immediately covering in New Jersey for an audience of really like plugged in political insiders. To have that kind of a perch professionally prior to the internet, I wouldn't have been able to get that coming out of college. And we can discuss, there's probably good things about that and bad things about that, because I did a lot of really dumb things in those early years in New Jersey. I was, one lesson I learned right away was I took this job in the fall of 2002 in New Jersey, and there was a big Senate race in New Jersey going on at the time. Control of the U.S. Senate was up for grabs. Democrats had the most tenuous majority heading into the 2002 midterms. George W. Bush was president. There was a Democratic senator in New Jersey running for re-election. His name was Bob Torricelli. He had just been reprimanded by the Senate Ethics Committee for taking cash and gifts and potentially bribes and this sort of thing, and nearly prosecuted for corruption. He was running for re-election. He was in grave danger. I took the job there at the height of that campaign, just after his reprimand. I got to the state. I had never spent any time in New Jersey in my life. And my first day on the job, I'm told that I have the first interview with Bob Torricelli after his reprimand. And I'm saying to myself, geez, this journalism thing, I'm pretty good at it, huh? I mean, look at this. And I meet him at the Marriott in Trenton, and he's going to be giving a speech in Camden, New Jersey, about 45 minutes away, and I'm going to interview him in a caravan, on his way to the event. And Torricelli was an aggressive politician, and I was a very, very unseasoned reporter. And I had, on my way out of the door that morning, I'd seen a poll just flash on TV on Channel 7 in New York that had him down 13 points. I didn't know anything about the poll. I just asked him as the first question about the new poll that had him down 13 points. And he had lots of methodological issues with the poll. And he he just turned around in the chair, got right in my face, and you don't know what you're talking about. No good reporter would quote that poll, blah, blah, blah. I'm brand new to this. And I'm like, geez, maybe a good reporter wouldn't ask him. And and then I realized that's why I got the interview so easily. I'm a new, unseasoned. So it was, I like to think that I learned fast in New Jersey. I like to think I got an opportunity to learn fast in New Jersey. I tell people that the 3 years I spent there were the funnest, most professionally satisfying 3 years of my career. It's the graduate school degree I never got, just following New Jersey politics. But it was made possible by the internet, and only by the internet. And I think that's been the thing that, broadly speaking, has changed politics the most in the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I would think, especially throughout your career, and in particular during the 2020 election cycle, this idea of polling, right, and numbers, working with data came up a lot. And numbers, of course, have a reputation for impartiality. But do you feel that their usage has become increasingly politicized in our current political discourse, or perhaps that they're often taken out of context?
Yeah, I think that there's a real challenge in the media right now, in political media right now, in that so much of political media now is partisan. Either overtly partisan or wink, wink, nod, nod partisan, but, and I think there's, people want numbers that make them feel good. People want numbers that, hey, our side's winning. The public agrees with us on this issue. See this thing we're doing, we don't just believe in it because it's right, it's also popular. There's a strong, strong instinct for that. And there's I think, equally strong aversion to numbers that would challenge that. Ooh, this thing I believe deeply is good for people, right, is actually rejected by those very people. Or they seem to have conflicted feelings about it. Or my candidate, they don't seem to like my candidate for this or that. So I think it presents a major challenge, because I think there's just generally speaking, I think there's been a trend in media. It's when I say the rise of the internet, I mean this has everything to do, I think, with the rise of the internet and social media. There's more media sources than ever before. I would say it's very easy to get attention through Twitter, through social media, within the media world. And I think one thing that seems to do very well in that ecosystem is our numbers that are flattering to the sensibilities of one tribe or the other.
Yeah, you touched on this a bit, with discussing the rise of the internet. But some people may have the sense, especially as we reflect on the Trump era, that with all of the discussions of fake news, that this is a new trend that has emerged as a consequence somehow of the depolarization revealed during the 2016 election cycle. This whole trend of decontextualizing numbers and taking polling data out of context. But I guess, would it be possible to sort of date this trend or pinpoint a particular origin for it? Or do you feel that maybe numbers, especially post-internet, have always been susceptible to this type of abuse?
Well, I think the bigger risk when it comes to numbers and data in politics is an over-reliance on them.
Right.
And this is something I think I've slowly, probably too slowly, definitely too slowly, kind of learned that I think trying to take the mood of the public when it comes to like an ideological question, let's say. I'll give you a good example here to try to make this more concrete. There's a couple examples like this, but when Joe Biden announced recently that, I'm going to cut corners in my characterization here, but a vaccine mandate, okay? When you poll the question of the vaccine mandate, should a vaccine mandate be imposed by businesses? Very, very strong support. Yeah, within the same, I'm thinking of one poll in particular here. I think it was about 65% support for the idea of vaccine mandates. So if you're a supporter of vaccine mandates, you very much like that number. And look at this, even there's a huge number of Republicans that say they support it. Okay. Now, in the same poll, they ask this question. Do you think that an employee who refuses to get vaccinated should lose their job? Overwhelming opposition. So there is a huge, that Venn diagram, there's a huge crossover of people who, on the one hand, are on the record supporting a vaccine mandate and opposing a consequence for the vaccine mandate. Right. So how do you measure the political mood there? I remember this in 2013, 2014. This was one that really sticks out in my mind. I don't know if you guys remember this. It was a terrible, terrible moment just in America. The Sandy Hook shooting. This was the mass shooting at the Connecticut school in Newtown in December 2012. So politically, the response to that mass shooting was, Obama was in his second term, Democrats still had the Senate. It was a renewed push for this background check. You looked at the scope of things, it was the message here that Obama, the Democrats put out was, this is really a limited thing we're asking for here in the face of this terrible tragedy. Surely, or for background checks, they got Joe Manchin, Republican and Democrat teamed up in the Senate to put this together. You took a poll of that question, and it was literally a 91-9 issue. Like nobody was against this when you polled this background check bill. And yet it was filibustered in the United States Senate. The Republicans, led the filibuster. Most Republicans, not all, but most Republicans filibustered the United States Senate, and it never went anywhere. And I can remember confident assertions from mainly Democrats, supporters of the background checks bill. You can't block something after a tragedy like Sandy Hook that 91% of the public supports, that even 78% of Republicans, you can't do that and not suffer political consequences. Do you know how many Republicans who voted to filibuster the background check bill lost in the next election? 0. Do you know how many Democrats who voted for the background check bill lost in the next election? 6. When you poll the question of gun control a different way, and you broaden the lens, and you ask people, do you think that gun laws in this country are too strict or too loose? It becomes a 50-50 question. So it raises the question to me, when you think about this, it's like, how do we, on any given issue, I think this is now my process when I think about it. You can think about a very narrow issue framed a very particular way in a poll, and you can be tempted into believing there's a strong conviction on the part of the public. Background checks is an example, vaccine mandates is another example. But try to broaden the lens. Try to broaden the lens to a more philosophical question. If you broaden the lens to a more philosophical question around guns, you get a 50-50 response. And I think the evidence from that 2014 election and the evidence from so many other elections and so many other issues is people vote on the broader measure. Right. They're not ever, I wouldn't say ever, but they're not usually voting on a very particular issue that's framed a certain way in a poll that matches up with something that's big in the news at the moment. Right. It's a broader philosophical thing. And I think there's a to me, that's a challenge just when I try to communicate polls and data and numbers on the air, is to get that perspective across.
On that note, I would feel, especially around elections and on election nights, for example, contextualizing exit poll data seems especially crucial. So how do you make sure that you're presenting these numbers accurately, but that you're also appropriately contextualizing this data for audiences?
Yeah, this one is a little easier, I think, only in that the good thing about election night is we get the exit polls, we get our first look. So we'll have the Virginia election coming up, the Virginia governor's race, in a couple weeks. The polls will close in Virginia at 7 o'clock, and Virginia is pretty good about reporting out its results. So by 7:30, we're going to have, I think, we're going to have a lot of the votes in from Virginia. But at 5 o'clock, we get our first readout from the exit polls. And we can't show you everything on the air. There's limitations just based on, if there's something in the exit poll that's going to really give away, like, hey, McAuliffe's up 8 points, we can't do anything like that. But we can show you information about what share of the electorate is this demographic, what share is that, sort of broad questions that were asked in the exit poll. So we will do some of that. I have, to me, it's like it's close enough to poll closing, and we're pretty restrained, I think, in what we put out there, that we're not, it's not going to sway the outcome or send anybody into a tizzy. But the thing in my mind, exit polls are very limited value in terms of communicating things on the air. My goal with exit polls, generally, I'll let you in a little secret. I don't want you to not watch me at 5 p.m. in 2 weeks, but my goal at 5 p.m. is to kill time till 7 p.m. Because at 7 p.m., we don't need the exit polls anymore because we have results. And in a state like Virginia, we're going to get results, I think, real fast, real thorough, and we're going to get a real story, and that's the story that I'm going to tell. And there may be something in the exit polls. As that story takes focus, there may be something in the exit poll that speaks very clearly to what we're seeing, and then I'll bring the exit poll on in that context. But and the other thing with exit polls too in the presidential election is, it's a tough thing to do on the air, but like we're going to get studies like Pew. We have these other studies that come out 6 months after the election that are going to be really good demographic breakdowns of what happened in the election that are going to just dwarf whatever's in the exit polls. So again, I feel like presidential election night, we will talk about the exit polls in the early hours. If there's something significant happening the exit poll points to, we'll talk to. But when I'm talking about the 2020 election right now and what happened, I'm talking about like Pew data. I'm not even talking about the exit polls anymore. So I try to downplay them.
Yeah, though moving to the 2020 presidential election specifically, in addition to the way certain numbers or statistics were presented, the language surrounding the election and its results has also very much come under fire. For example, President Biden's win has been presented by some as a landslide, even though in terms of the electoral vote, the margin was very similar to President Trump's win in 2016. On the other hand, the Trump campaign also essentially promised a victory to its voters and was given a platform through media with right-wing leanings, which was later a launching pad for accusations of voter fraud and election rigging that arguably culminated in the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Political tribalism, incidentally, is the focus of your 2018 book, The Red and the Blue. So does the language used to discuss elections then, do you feel that contributes to or reflects the tribalism in our country, and what ought to be done to ensure that both predictions of elections and the actual results themselves are being discussed in a more even-handed way in the media and, of course, the political arena more broadly?
Yeah, I think it absolutely reflects it. I think there's no question. Yeah. It's dismaying to me in that I've been telling people for years that I feel like I kind of occupy a bit of an island in terms of what I do. Whether you're on the Team Blue, a Democrat, whether you're on Team Red, a Republican, you all want to know who's winning the game. And you want to know, hey, my side is winning. Why? How could we still lose? You want to know if your team's not winning. How can we still win? What are the weaknesses? And that's the kind of world on air that I kind of live in and exist in. And I have felt for a long time now, and I still feel this way generally, that allows me to. I can speak the same way to a blue audience as a red audience, and there actually is sort of a common language there. Obviously, they may react to the material differently, but I've felt good about I think being able to do that. obviously concerned for what you're describing right there about where things might be headed. I do think there were some particular aspects of the 2020 election that just were conducive to the kind of interpretation you're talking about. Just the COVID changes, sudden, the procedures were very different than they'd ever been. There was I don't need to tell you guys, a four-day delay in getting a call in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania could not open up mail ballots before Election Day. We can get into why they couldn't open up ballots before Election Day, but they couldn't, and it took them a long time to count. And I don't think we're going to have famous last words, but I think there are elements of 2020 that will not exist after 2020. I think to the extent that there are changes to procedures that are going to be long-term coming out of 2020, states are going to learn how to deal with them better and not leave us hanging. I say this, of course, as California is still counting votes from the recall last month, but God forbid a national election ever come down to California, by the way. That would be a terrible thing. But I think a state like Pennsylvania in 2024, it might not, the conditions may not be in place like that. That's my hope.
Right.
On that similar note, what does it really mean for journalists when an election night, for example, turns into election month? Like we saw the doubt that was cast on the electoral system at large when Trump called into question the results of the election. So what does this mean from a journalistic perspective, and what does it mean for perceptions of our electoral system at large?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when I think back to last year's election. We do sort of simulations ahead of time. We have the data come in, and then we try to figure out. It's my way of familiarizing myself with. What if this happens in Ohio, and how I recognize it? And so we go through a whole bunch of them. And I was ready for a scenario on election night 2020 where it was like a 90-minute election, and that was Biden wins Florida, because we knew that Florida was going to report. Florida is. By the way, if I'll just say this is just, I only mean this in terms of the way elections are administered in Florida, site of the worst electoral disaster, election administration disaster of modern times, the 2000 election. Since then, the way Florida administers elections and reports out votes on election night is the most efficient of any big state anywhere. And if every state could do that, I think we'd have resolution on election night. So we knew Florida, we were going to get a very particular series of vote. Every county was going to have this vote come in, then within 90 minutes, this vote come in. And then the Panhandle was going to be an hour behind because it's in the central time zone. So we knew exactly what to expect in Florida. We figured we would be able to get a call out of Florida that night. If Biden won Florida, that's essentially the election. So we were ready for, we wouldn't have, called the election. Our decision desk wouldn't have called the election on the spot, but we would have been talking on the air about it's over, Biden's won the election. So we were ready for a 90-minute election, but then we got the other version of it. And I just, all I can say is I went in there knowing it could go a few days. I got in there on Saturday morning last year. It was called at 11:30 on Saturday morning. I thought on Saturday morning it might go even longer. Mm-hmm. I was getting some conflicting signals from our decision desk about exactly what the standard was going to be to call it. We knew where it was going by that point, but my approach is just to be as transparent as we can on the air. And the challenge, I think, is just the challenge of the voting changes generally from COVID, but just the rise of mail voting in general, is you've got different voting methods favored disproportionately by each party. Democrats just are voting by mail, just much, much more likely to vote by mail than Republicans. So when you get to the mail ballot portion of the vote count, suddenly you start getting a flood of votes for the Democratic candidate. We're going to see this in Virginia in a few weeks. Right. All the data we're seeing from the early voting in Virginia is Democrats are doing it more than Republicans. And when you get to the same day votes, the votes that were cast in person on Election Day, we're going to start getting those reported out at once. It's going to be big numbers for the Republicans. And my goal is just to know ahead of time as best we can, and the states don't make this easy sometimes, but to know as best we can ahead of time what the pattern is going to be in any given state, in any key county, and to be able to communicate that on the air to people so that, hey, yes, I know, we were just looking at, Chesterfield County, Virginia a minute ago, and Glenn Youngkin was up 12 points. And now Terry McAuliffe is up by 6 points. What the heck just happened? Well, what just happened is they released 62,000 mail-in ballots, and McAuliffe won, 71% of them. I mean, that's the kind of thing I want to be in position to explain to people, because the way they're done now is there can be these wild and dramatic swings that on paper make you go, is that a little fishy? And there are reasons that have to do with what I'm describing, and my goal is just to make sure we can describe them.
Yeah, and I guess something that was sort of alluded to earlier in discussing some of the, ramifications of vote counting is that President Trump's legal team sought to use litigation as a tool to invalidate election results. Over the summer, some documents released by the House Oversight Committee, for example, demonstrated how Trump's staff sought to pressure the Department of Justice into launching investigations of election results, feeding them talking points about rigged voting machines, and I think even Italian satellite activity at one point. So as a student of not only election data, but public opinion data, what are the optics of a sitting president endorsing litigation to overturn election results? And one of our big pictures this semester is looking at, the implications of a lot of the past year for American democracy. So what would you say the broader implications of this are for confidence, the public's confidence in American democracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, to the extent this becomes a partisan thing, and the sorts of developments you're describing there, I mean, the concern is just it could, in theory, go farther than it did in the aftermath of 2020, and I think where that could come into play would be more in terms of like a state legislature ultimately deciding, well, we're going to reject what the official or what the Secretary of State is saying are the vote results, in our state. Yeah, say it's Biden versus Trump again. I mean, Biden, was recorded as the winner by 14,000, but the state legislature could theoretically reject it and send its own slate of electors, to Washington, and then theoretically, the House of Representatives. Well, you saw what Trump was asking, Mike Pence to do right there. There's that's the realm where I think it didn't get there in 2020. That's a really I think dark place if it in any election, if it gets there in this country. I mean, you're getting back to like that's the historical parallel for that would be like 1876. This was the Hayes-Tilden election that just coming off the Civil War, and there's all the so. That's the level. It just in theory, I think I would have worry that it goes to.
Yeah. Before we move into audience questions, we have a few more, I guess, big picture questions. I think one reason a lot of students come to the forum is to hear leaders in politics or media like yourself, give advice on what they can do to stay engaged and do their part in American democracy. And so my question to you would be, what would you say the single biggest thing we as college students can be doing right now to preserve our democracy is, especially in such a tumultuous time?
It's a good question. I guess the irony of this is the trite answer, and the one we're kind of trained to give, is go vote, right? And it was like just my whole life, starting in probably elementary school when we had our Bush-Dukakis 1988 fake election, and we all had to vote. And, I think Dukakis lost our school, believe it or not, in Massachusetts. It was the more people vote, the healthier the democracy will be. Right. And we just saw the number of people who voted in 2020. I couldn't have imagined ever seeing vote in a presidential election. You're talking 160 million people, up from just over 130 million in 2016. You're talking about a midterm election in 2018 where 116 million people voted, up from 89 million in a comparable midterm election in 2014. These are just astronomical levels of voter participation, and yet look where we are. So it's not to say don't vote. Voting is important, but I think there's something kind of bigger going on. And I think one of the things that just concerns me is, and this is the title of the book when you talk about tribalism. Right. It's just what worries me, big picture, is just that there's this the two Americas, the red America, the blue America. There is very little overlap between. I mean, I think that the stat is in the book, but like this question was asked in a poll 4 years ago: would you be upset, Democrat? Would you be upset if your child married a Republican? 66% yes. Republican, 66%. I mean, these are numbers that you used to see for like interracial marriage in the 1960s, 1950s. Now you see them for political party. It just troubles me that the way things have evolved in our politics, it is very possible, it's very easy to be incredibly politically engaged and to live completely and totally in a political media ecosystem that has no actual contact with the other side. And I feel like that drives a lot of this. So try to break out of that.
All right, amazing. Well, at this time, we would like to invite audience members to go up to the mics for questions. All questioners should introduce themselves by name and with their university affiliation. Please ask one brief question, and all questions should end with a question mark and should not be speeches or your own commentary. There are 4 microphones, 2 on the floor level and 2 on the box level. Please line up at the microphone closest to you. All right. Awesome. Audrey, can we go ahead and start asking people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Shamoon. I'm a senior at the college, and I was an editor on the Harvard Political Review that sits here at the IOP for 2 years. So I have like more of a journalistic question. I'm wondering what your approach is when it comes to like telling a story through data, and how you best, like what you find is the best manner in which to communicate like the broader story using those points of data.
Yeah, I think it depends. Obviously, if we're getting outside of an election night here and just in the run-up to it, it's sort of what I was describing earlier. Let's say take that question of vaccines. I think we might have actually done that one on the air. That's probably why it's fresh in my mind. But it's I'm very aware of day to day when we're talking about data related to whatever the issue of the day is, trying to look at it and come at it from a couple different angles, because the data often will look very different from different angles. And there's usually one that again, I find this is very true through certainly through social media, where it's like, one side will push the one data point that's perfectly conducive to their positioning that day, and my reaction to that generally is, let me look at the other angles here and make sure there's not something that's going to put this in a very different light. Often there is something that puts it in the other light, and my goal is to show both of those things, and to just sort of say, hey, there may be some complexity here, and be aware of it.
Great. All right, we can take a question from this microphone next.
Yeah, Alex White. I'm a junior at the college. Sorry to share bad news. Astros won, Sox 0, 5th inning.
Ooh.
But so when the big board lights up, there's a lot of red outside of the cities, and it seems like all the blue is in those urban areas.
Yep.
Some suburbs now. When you look at the numbers, do you think Democrats can change that? How can they do that? And if you want to predict, will they?
It's a long-term issue it's the long-term story of our politics. There are 3,100, give or take, 3,100 counties in the United States. Trump won, around 2,700 of them, 2,700 in both 2020 and 2016. Barack Obama, when he got reelected in 2012, won by 4 points nationally. He won 690 of the 3,100 counties. The last Democrat to win more than 1,000 counties was Bill Clinton in 1996. Bill Clinton in both 1996 and 1992 won, give or take, 1,500 counties. He won about half the counties in the country. If you look at one of those county maps of the country, that's the last time a Democrat got real impact outside of the metro areas. 1996. Al Gore in 2000, it was 480, something like that. Even between 96 and 2000, it was a massive change. Kerry, Obama, even in victory for Obama. So this has been a story for a long time. To me, it's like demographically, when you look at it, it's the college, non-college divide. You know, we do this on the air a lot. I'm trained now to look for it in every poll we see. It's particularly among white voters. You know, about 2/3, about 7 in 10 voters nationally are still white. The number drops about 2 points every 4 years, but it's still a very high number. And it's not quite a 50-50 split among white voters. There are more white non-college voters than white college voters, and these two groups could not be moving in more different directions politically. And white college-educated voters much more likely to be found either in cities or in metropolitan areas, and so you just see Virginia is going to be a great example of this. In 2 weeks, is something I'll be talking about all night on the air. You'll be so sick of me talking about Arlington County, Fairfax County, Alexandria, even, going out to Stafford County. You're getting further out here. Just Loudoun County, massive sea changes in the last 20 years in the voting patterns on pocketbook issues, the suburbs with college-educated white voters through the 90s. Even into the 2000s, a little bit of George W. Bush, we're still very Republican friendly, and have just become, I think on cultural grounds, I think is what is basically driving it, and especially in reaction to Donald Trump, are just becoming deeply, deeply blue. And meanwhile, rural places all across the country, exurban, but rural in particular, you are seeing, there's a county in Virginia, again, we'll talk about it in 2 weeks, in far southwest Virginia, that Bill Clinton got I believe it's 78% of the vote in, something along those lines, in 1996 when he got reelected, where Joe Biden got less than 20%. Wow. So, there used to be a component. This goes back a New Deal. This has to do with the New Deal. There used to be an aspect of the Democratic coalition that was blue collar, that was rural, and that Bill Clinton, I think, revived it in the 1990s. But historically, you look at it now, Bill Clinton was a one-off. Al Gore was unable to sustain that. And you can get into all the questions, why is that? I believe, just personally, I think Bill Clinton, there was just I'm not the first to say Bill Clinton was incredibly gifted politically, but Bill Clinton knew how to forge a cultural connection with the kinds of voters I'm describing who Democrats have lost. And his vice president, Al Gore, when he ran in 2000, on paper, Al Gore was very similar to Bill Clinton, a moderate Democrat from the South. Al Gore was from Tennessee. Bill Clinton was from Arkansas. They were of a similar generation. Al Gore actually had Vietnam service. Bill Clinton didn't. On paper, sure, Al Gore should be able to win over those voters. Al Gore, I believe, just communicated through his style, his bearing, his word choice, the way he communicated something that was culturally alien to the kinds of voters I'm describing. And what the line of the campaign, I think, when you think back to 2000, there are all sorts of reasons why George W. Bush ended up the president in 2000 and not Al Gore. We can get into Florida, the ballot, the hanging chads, the votes for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County. Al Gore couldn't carry his home state of Tennessee. He'd been elected to the United States Senate there, to the House of Representatives. His dad had been a senator. He couldn't carry Tennessee. His dad had been a senator. I said, so the line that I think won George W. Bush Tennessee in 2000 gets that one. He came to the state the weekend before the election, and he said, in Tennessee, Bush says, my opponent said the other day, I heard him say he's going to carry his home state. And he pauses and he says, well, he may win the District of Columbia, but I intend to win the state of Tennessee. And he was saying, he's gone Washington. He's one of them. He's not one of you. He's saying it with the Texas drawl. And George W. Bush carried Tennessee, and he carried Arkansas, and he carried all those voters in those places that Bill Clinton had been able to carry 4 years ago. And every Democrat, I think, has been stuck since then with that same identity that that Gore had in 2000.
Thank you. Let's go up here.
Hi, My name is Olivia, and I'm a dual degree graduate student with HKS and MIT. And I was interested to hear your anecdote tonight about using simulations to prepare for Election Day. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you and your colleagues prepare, like both tactically and also how you prepare personally for such intense coverage over those few days, and then also how you just maintain your mental stamina over that period.
I mean, yeah. Well, like I said, I thought it could have been a 90-minute night, so it was a bit of a surprise to me when the last one went on the way it did. No, it's just the simulations that we do are just really helpful. I'll go, stand at that board that you see on TV, and the data will populate in the board just like it would on election night, and sometimes it'll be double speed or something like that. But you get a sense of, and it's obviously. The folks putting the data in are stressing, hey, this is not a prediction. There's all sorts of variables here, but you do enough of them, you get a range of potential outcomes. So I mean, I can remember doing it in 2018, for the midterm elections, and there were versions where the Republicans kept the House in 2018. There were versions where the Democrats got the House. So it helps me to recognize what the potential. I kind of go into Virginia. I will go into the night with a number that I think is sort of the break-even number. I'm going to say for Youngkin, the Republican, he's trying to sort of pull off the upset and get elected. Here's the number Youngkin needs to be at in every county. If he's north of this is a good night for Republicans. If he's south of this is a good night for Democrats. That's the thing I'm looking for. Going through the simulations ahead of time just helps me get a sense of, as that picture comes into focus in every county, what the kind of benchmarks are along the way. It's not foolproof, especially in this era, as I say, with all the variables now with early voting, with mail-in voting, and there's a lot of question marks just about the sequence of how votes get released in every state. So I'm feeling a little bit of stress as I'm looking ahead to Virginia, but that's the goal of the simulations, and that's I'm going back tomorrow morning or I think it's now 3 tomorrow afternoon. We're doing another one, so bunch of those between now and then.
All right, let's go up here.
Oh, hi, my name is Gordon Ebanks. I'm a sophomore at the college in Kirkland House. And my question is, in your time as a political journalist, what election in modern American history has contributed or changed most the way you understand American politics and culture, and why?
Ooh, that's a very good question. 2016 is close, but I think I'd say 2016, just in that there were so many supposed rules about American politics and elections that Donald Trump broke and still got elected. There were also so many things that were said by political experts in the wake of the 2012 election when Obama got reelected that, the Republicans cannot win until they do X. And if you remember, after the 2012 election, the Republicans themselves, the RNC, commissioned an autopsy, and they had very specific recommendations. One of the biggest was on the issue of immigration, that the party had to change on immigration if it was going to have any chance in 2016. And there could not have gone farther in the other direction of the autopsy and of all of the conventional wisdom in politics than by nominating Donald Trump. And yet Donald Trump won by maximizing support with a demographic that I think we had undervalued the power of, and bringing out voters from that demographic who, frankly, we didn't know would come out and vote. And so I think looking at you can draw. I'm picturing the map right now, and you go from North Dakota. You could start from kind of the eastern half of North Dakota, and you could work your way into Missouri, and then you can start working your way east and go through sort of Appalachia and up into western New York, the northeast kingdom of Vermont, northern New Hampshire, gritty Berlin, New Hampshire, western Maine. These are places I'm describing demographically that are heavily white, older, non-college, blue collar. And in many of these places had not voted for a Republican since Reagan or Bush in the 80s. And so many of them on that map in one fell swoop went for Trump in 2016. That he found that, and he may have found it completely accidentally, but he found that group, and that was something that wasn't anticipated really, by anybody. And so I think that, I was tempted to say 2014 because there was a lot in 2014 that in hindsight was a prelude to 2016, and I think there was a lot in the 2014 midterm where I was sort of, I learned the 2014 made me a lot more skeptical, I would say, but I think the answer is 2016.
Back this way.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a first year at the college, and I guess I just wanted to ask a question about how different networks sort of make their own calls. I remember that when I was watching the election night coverage, I would routinely switch and wait for all three major networks to make a uniform call. When Fox News called Arizona, it was like I trusted the call, but I also was like, okay, if we're looking at the same data from the Associated Press, why has CNN and MSNBC not called it with them? And I just wanted to know, if you guys all have decision desks and you guys are all making the same predictions by the end of the night because you guys haven't been wrong for 20 years now, what is the reason why there's just sort of that difference in terms of the call? Because at the end of the day, Fox News ended up being right with that Arizona call, got a lot of criticism for it, but then obviously they ended up being right. And why wasn't there a call from, at least from MSNBC's standpoint, 2 hours earlier than when it was actually made? Or something like that. I'm just asking sort of looking at the same data, how do you not arrive at the same conclusion at the same time? Just wondering.
Maybe we should bring Arnon up here for this one. I'd be interested too. No, I think there is a mechanical explanation that's probably worth knowing, and that is that not every network now is using the same data. So you mentioned the Associated. There was sort of a split in the last few years. The data provider, the election night data provider that we use at NBC and a lot of the others use is different than what Fox and the Associated Press were using. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Fox and the Associated Press made the call earlier than we did. I think just based on looking at having a different data provider. So I think that that goes into it. Each decision desk, I think, has its own sort of standards and rules. I was talking to Arnon before this about Virginia in 2020, which was not a real competitive state, in 2020. Joe Biden won it by 10 points. But I was just went back the other day to reconstruct how long it took NBC to call Virginia in 2020 in anticipation of the governor's race this year. And I was like, we didn't call it till 12:05 a.m. We called Virginia. And I said, what the heck was going on in Virginia? I don't even remember this being suspenseful. And it wasn't, but what it was the vote return pattern, and this is typical in Virginia elections. The Republican areas tend to report first. So your on-air count in Virginia will have the Republican leading sometimes for hours in the course of the night. And those big Democratic, friendly areas in Northern Virginia will report late. And in 2020, Fairfax County at 11:43 p.m. dumped something like 250,000 mail ballots. And they were like 90% Joe Biden. And he took the lead. It was the first time he took the lead in a statewide count. And our decision desk standard was, what they wanted to do in the case of Virginia was, we don't have any doubt really where this is going, but we're going to wait till Joe Biden actually has the lead on the air. So they waited. But if you would talk to them at 8:30 at night and said, should Democrats be worried about what they're seeing in Virginia, I don't think they would have been. So that sort of stuff goes into it too. That's where it's an art, not a science.
Great. We'll go back over here.
Hi, yes. I'm Adam. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Harvard Kennedy School, and thank you so much for being here tonight. My question is regarding the 2020 election. We saw a lot of unique circumstances with the counting of ballots, right? With large mail-in ballots and different state regulations that kind of determined when they would be counted. I remember there were some strange preliminary outcomes with Biden up maybe 10 points in Ohio and down 10 points in Pennsylvania early on. With everybody kind of watching with bated breath and you're up there on election night, how do you deal with that ambiguity and uncertainty in real time?
Yeah, it's not well. No, it's the one that got me was so we knew, I felt the best going into 2020 about the first hour, because I knew it was going to be all about Florida. And like I was saying, Florida is so orderly in how they report out the results. So I knew exactly what we were expecting in Florida. We were going to get all of the mail and early vote basically all reported out in one bunch. The state law is within 30 minutes of poll closing time, every county has to report out essentially all of its mail-in and early vote. And then they begin putting in their same-day vote after that. So you've got a benchmark going back several elections for every county in Florida. What was that first report? What was the first report from Miami-Dade? What was the first report from Broward of their mail-in and their early vote? And are we deviating from that at all here? So it was just, we had a perfect approach to Florida, I thought. So right away, I remember I was on the air, it might have been 7:10 or something, and the Florida map starts lighting up, and right away, it's like, this is exactly what I was imagining. I'm like, I feel like the quarterback, it's like, oh, this is the defense that I was expecting. And my producer comes into my ear, and he says, Steve, we have a problem. You got to come back here and talk to me. And as I'm on the air, so I actually excuse myself, and I'm like, what? And there was a glitch in the data that we were getting that was displaying in our system the vote that was coming in from these counties as same day and not early. It's an entirely different story if this is same day vote versus mail. And I'm saying, what the heck are you talking about? It's like, this is Florida. It's all, I'm like, I know this is, and so I'm paralyzed. I cannot go back on the air and talk about this if there's a chance this is the same day. So it was the longest 90 seconds of my life. We immediately got it cleared up. No, there's a glitch in the system. I went back out there, but it's like, to me, and it's what gives me a lot of stress, anxiety before elections, and it's on my mind for Virginia right now. That's the kind of stuff we have to be ready to do in these states, and it's in the era of widespread sort of different voting methods. There's a lot of challenges there that didn't used to be there.
Let's go up here.
Hi, I'm Clive Lawrence. I'm a first year at the college. Thank you for being here. You kind of talked at the beginning and also at the end of the discussion about the kind of bubble situation where the two different groups are kind of polarized, not really interacting with each other. So I was wondering what you thought TV and other kind of a little bit older, more traditional media's role should be in kind of dissuading these bubbles from forming and continuing.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question because just the nature of this stuff has changed. It's just in the course of certainly my lifetime and more recently than that. But like I was saying earlier, a study group I was talking to, if you just went back and looked at the audience size for the network nightly newscasts, the CBS Evening News, at NBC Nightly News, in the 1990s, say, you were still 15, but into the 90s, you were still at 15 million. In the early 90s, late 80s, you were at 20 million a night. You had big audiences that were tuned to a few places. Cable was absolutely like an exotic thing. And in fact, in the 80s and well into the 90s, the only cable news channel was CNN. And CNN was, the big moment for CNN was 1991. It was the Gulf War, and they had round-the-clock coverage of a war. So for the first decade, they were very, very kind of novelty. So I think there was just a landscape, a generation ago, a landscape where there were a few dominant news sources that really did talk to politically diverse audiences. And now we live in an era of, it's not just the rise of cable channels and the fragmentation that comes with that. It's now the rise of the internet. It's the rise, more particularly in the last decade, I think, of social media, of clips going on social media, of tweets going up, that the tweet itself drives the political debate and political conversation all day. And the definition of a big audience now in media, in television, is a fraction. The kind of audience you need to succeed in television now is a fraction of what it was a generation ago. And if your challenge is to find an audience that's this instead of this, you don't have to, I think there's incentives there that take you away sometimes from, being very broad with the audience you're seeking. And I think that's a significant, I think, kind of issue in media.
Great. All right, well, we're approaching the end of our time here, so we'll be taking one last question from the audience before wrapping up, and we'll go over here.
Hi, I'm Rave. I'm a first year at the college, concentrating in computer science, and I wanted to ask, with a lot of polarization in the media and a lot of ways to skew data, do you think that polls can be a reliable source? Because there's a lot of concern that a lot of the polls during the election cycles can't actually project whether a candidate will win or not when taking error margins into account, which was seen in the 2016 election. So do you think that polls can be a reliable or a valuable source in that time period before we get the actual results, or should we be wary of these numbers?
I mean, I think it's both. I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I definitely would caution against, putting too much into the polls and treating it as a substitute for the election. And I think obviously 2016 and 2020 should be the ultimate kind of, cautionary notes there. At the same time, my view on polling is, first of all, the campaigns are doing it. The campaigns are relentlessly polling and relentlessly paying attention to the polling and making decisions that are based on the polling. And if we look at next year when we get to the midterm elections, one of the big questions is going to be resources. Which candidates are getting money, which candidates are getting visits from surrogates, this sort of thing, which races are being prioritized by the national parties, and polling is going to have so I just think we got to be there in terms of covering the polling, being aware of the polling, because it's such an integral part of what politics is now. The question about the reliability, I think, is interesting only in that my suspicion is it's not a coincidence that the two biggest misses have been Trump on the ballot. And I think it has a lot to do with that demographic I'm describing that he kind of brought out that had not necessarily participated previously in elections, and that I think every indication is a very hard demographic for pollsters to reach. And there were all sorts of efforts that were made between 2016 and 20. That was what the lesson the pollsters drew from 2016, was we need to reach those. Our polls need to have more of a non-college white, rural non-college white, older component in our polls, because that's the group that powered Trump. That's the group we missed getting into our polls in 2016. And if we don't have them in our polls in 2020, our polls won't be accurate. So all sorts of steps were taken. You probably heard this whole discussion about weighting by education. Right. That was kind of the most basic thing that could be done, but there were other efforts that were undertaken, and they still missed. And that starts to raise questions about, is there just something more systematic going on here where the voters that Trump has tapped into just aren't going to talk to pollsters and just aren't going to be reachable by pollsters. But I would note that you come off of two things. The biggest misses, 2016 and 2020, were in the states with the highest concentrations of non-college white voters. Wisconsin is a big miss. The smallest misses in the 2016 and 2020 polling were in the states with larger concentrations of the college-educated white voters, the Democratic-friendly voters, Georgia and Arizona. Georgia had basically no polling miss in 2020, and then in the runoff election in January, the 2 Senate seats in the Georgia runoff, everybody was terrified to poll Georgia because of what just happened. But there were 5 pollsters that went in and did Georgia in the advance of that runoff, and they had the Democrats winning by a small margin in most of those polls. They got it right. So the polling miss, I think there's a case to be made here that there's a Trump-specific aspect. There are big issues in polling with just people. It's tough to reach people's cell phones. They don't answer phones. They don't talk to all that stuff. I don't mean to diminish or downplay that, but I think the really dramatic, kind of election-altering misses of 2016 and 2020, I do think they may be heavily related to Trump being on the ballot, and without Trump on the ballot, it may be a less dire story when it comes to polling.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Steve, for a wonderful conversation in the forum.
Thank you, everybody.
We hope to see you all back here tomorrow at 6 p.m. when the forum welcomes Chris Krebs, the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Dr. Joan Donovan, research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. They'll discuss securing democracy, misinformation, disinformation, and the cyber war for the 2022 midterms. Please join us here in the audience or streaming online on our social media platforms, and have a great night.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, wow.